The US Presidency is the chief executive institution of the federal government where a single elected leader exercises constitutional, political, and administrative authority to shape national policy at home and abroad. The formal sources of power of the U.S. President, as outlined in the U.S. Constitution, are the powers to act as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, to grant pardons and reprieves, to make treaties with the advice and consent of the Senate, to nominate and appoint ambassadors, judges, and other officers with Senate approval, and to sign or veto legislation passed by Congress. The power of Commander-in-Chief means the President leads the U.S. military and, for example, authorized continued support and defense aid to Ukraine during the conflict with Russia in recent years. The power to grant pardons and reprieves, which allows the President to forgive federal offenses, was used when President Trump issued pardons to individuals involved in the attack on the U.S. Capitol in 2025. The power to make treaties, requiring two-thirds Senate approval, allows the President to negotiate international agreements such as the AUKUS Security Pact with the UK and Australia. The power to nominate and appoint officials, where the Senate confirms, was seen when President Biden appointed Ketanji Brown Jackson to the Supreme Court in 2022. The power to sign or veto legislation means the President can approve or reject bills passed by Congress, as shown when President Biden vetoed the Judges Act in late 2024. The President has the role of the head of state, which means that the President symbolically represents the nation to both the American people and other countries and performs ceremonial and unifying functions. An example of the President fulfilling this role is Joe Biden's 2023 visit to Kiev to show solidarity with Ukraine during the war with Russia, emphasizing unity and support. The President also has the role of the head of government, which means that the President directs the executive branch, implements and enforces laws, and sets national policy priorities. An example of the President fulfilling this role is when President Biden imposed sanctions on Russia and authorized substantial military and economic aid to Ukraine, guiding national policy. These powers have been significant as they allow the President to shape domestic and foreign policy and respond to national and international crises without sole reliance on Congress. An example of this is the widespread use of executive orders by President Trump in 2025 to direct federal action on issues such as AI regulation and immigration, reflecting major policy initiatives. However, these powers may not have been significant as they can be limited or checked by Congress, the courts, and political constraints, reducing unilateral action. An example of this is when courts blocked or challenged executive orders from recent administrations, demonstrating judicial checks on presidential authority. The informal sources of presidential power are the electoral mandate from their election victory, the ability to issue executive orders, influence gained through national events and crises, and authority drawn from their cabinet of advisors. The electoral mandate gives a president perceived legitimacy to pursue their agenda, as seen when President Biden cited his 2020 election victory to push through infrastructure and social spending early in his term. Executive orders allow a president to direct government action without Congress, as shown by President Trump's 2025 executive order aimed at blocking state AI regulations. National events can strengthen a president's power when they lead public opinion or shift priorities, as when President Biden responded to the COVID-19 pandemic with nationwide vaccination campaigns and policy measures. The cabinet, composed of department heads and senior officials, advises the president and helps coordinate policy, as seen when President Biden's cabinet officials worked together on the federal response during Hurricane Ida in 2021. The president also has powers of persuasion, which are the ability to use speeches, media engagement, and negotiation to influence Congress, public opinion, and state leaders to support their policies. For Joe Biden, this meant regularly addressing the nation and Congress to build support for his Build Back Better and infrastructure plans. For Donald Trump, it involved rally speeches and direct communication to pressure legislators on border and economic policies. For Barack Obama, it was evident in his televised appeals for the Affordable Care Act. For Donald Trump in his first term, it included social media and rally-driven pressure on tax and trade reforms. For George W. Bush, it was clear in his postal 9/11 addresses that united public support for security legislation. The President also has access to the Executive Office of the President, which has the roles of providing expert advice and administrative support for policy making and implementation across government, coordinating national security and foreign policy through the National Security Council, overseeing the federal budget and regulatory review via the Office of Management and Budget, and managing the President's immediate staff and communications through the White House office. The Executive Office of the President serves as the President's central hub for policy development and coordination across the executive branch, helping to draft and analyze proposals and communicate priorities to agencies and Congress, as seen in the role it played in shaping key federal initiatives in recent years. The National Security Council advises and assists the President on national security and foreign policy and coordinates these matters across government, exemplified by the restructuring and staffing changes in 2025 that aligned it with the current administration's strategic priorities. The Office of Management and Budget oversees the preparation and execution of the federal budget and reviews regulatory and legislative proposals to ensure they align with the President's objectives, as shown by its issuance of guidance in December 2025 directing federal agencies on unbiased artificial intelligence procurement. The White House office manages the President's daily operations, staff, and messaging, including digital strategy and communications efforts that support policy priorities and public engagement. These powers have been significant as they allow presidents to shape policy and respond to urgent issues more effectively than through formal powers alone. An example of this is how President Biden's use of executive orders and persuasion helped advance COVID-19 vaccination efforts and economic support legislation in the face of divided government. However, these powers may not have been significant as they can be constrained by opposition from Congress, courts, and shifts in public opinion that limit a president's ability to act unilaterally. An example of this is when the US House of Representatives voted to overturn one of President Trump's executive orders in 2025, demonstrating legislative pushback on presidential initiatives. There are many factors that affect the presidency and many limitations on presidential power. The relationship between the presidency and Congress is shaped by a constitutional balance of powers where the president proposes and advocates policy but must work with Congress to pass laws, fund government operations, and make appointments. This relationship varies as it depends on whether the president's party controls one or both chambers of Congress and on the political climate, which affects cooperation or conflict on legislation. An example of this varying relationship is the 2025 United States federal government shutdown when Republican and Democratic lawmakers failed to agree on funding measures for over 40 days before passing a bill that the president signed, highlighting deep partisan stalemate with Congress. The relationship between the presidency and the Supreme Court is dynamic and defined by judicial review and constitutional interpretation, where the court can uphold or limit presidential actions while presidents influence the court's composition through appointments. This relationship varies as the court may support or constrain presidential policies depending on legal arguments and the justices' interpretations of the Constitution. An example of this varying relationship is the 2024 Trump versus United States Supreme Court ruling that granted substantial immunity to a president for core official acts but clarified limits on immunity for unofficial acts, shaping the scope of presidential authority. The limitations on presidential power are the changing nature of power over the president's term in office, the role of Congress in legislation and oversight, the Supreme Court's judicial review, the constraints of the Constitution itself, the election cycle with midterm and general elections, and divided government where control of Congress and the presidency differ. The changing nature of power over a president's term varies because as a term progresses and the political environment changes, a president's influence can grow or diminish, as seen when presidents lose seats at midterm elections leading to weaker legislative leverage. Congress limits presidential power through its lawmaking authority, oversight, and control of budgets, as seen in 2025 when congressional deadlock over funding led to a prolonged government shutdown that constrained executive action. The Supreme Court limits presidential power by striking down or upholding executive actions based on constitutional grounds, as illustrated by the Trump versus United States decision influencing the legal boundaries of presidential immunity and accountability. The Constitution itself limits presidential power by dividing authority among branches and outlining specific roles and checks, as evident in the separation of powers that prevents any branch from encroaching on others. The election cycle limits presidential power because midterm and general elections can change the composition of Congress and public support, affecting policy agendas and legislative success, as seen in multiple shifts in control following midterms in recent decades. Divided government limits presidential power because opposing party control of one or both chambers of Congress can stymie legislative priorities, as seen during Barack Obama's second term when Republican control of the House slowed his legislative agenda. These limitations have been significant as they have enforced checks and balances that prevent unchecked executive authority and require negotiation and compromise across branches. An example of this is the repeated federal government shutdowns triggered by clashes between the President and Congress over budget priorities, demonstrating how institutional checks can halt or delay executive initiatives. These limitations may not have been significant, as at times presidents have used executive orders or benefited from a Supreme Court sympathetic to their view, enabling substantial policy changes without sweeping legislative approval. An example of this is the Supreme Court allowing a president to remove independent federal agency commissioners in 2025, affirming executive authority over agency appointments and weakening constraints on presidential control of regulatory bodies. Interpretations and debates over the US presidency center on how effectively presidents achieve their aims, the extent to which their power expands or is constrained, and the balance between their roles in domestic governance and foreign policy. The president has effectively achieved their aims as they have passed major legislation and shaped significant policy outcomes domestically and internationally, such as boosting infrastructure and climate action. An example that proves this is President Biden signing the Inflation Reduction Act and Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which together represent substantial investment in climate action and infrastructure across the United States. However, the president may not have achieved aims, as public perception and political realities have sometimes undermined or slowed the implementation or acceptance of key policy goals. An example that proves this is how President Biden's efforts on immigration and inflation struggle to gain public approval despite legislative successes, contributing to political backlash in recent years. An imperial presidency is one where the executive branch expands its authority beyond constitutional limits, whereas an imperiled presidency is one where executive power is weakened by strong checks from other branches or political constraints. The presidency is more imperial, as some recent administrations have sought to expand executive action through broad use of executive orders and expansive interpretations of presidential authority in foreign and domestic policy. An example that proves this is concerns raised about President Trump's use of unilateral executive actions in his second term that critics argued risked overstepping constitutional checks and concentrating power. However, the presidency may be more imperiled as intense scrutiny, legal challenges and political opposition have constrained executive ambitions and highlighted limits on unilateral presidential power. An example that proves this is the House of Representatives shelving an effort to impeach President Trump over unauthorized military strikes on Iran, demonstrating how political dynamics can protect or restrict executive accountability. The president has been held accountable by Congress to a greater extent, as impeachment inquiries and investigations have forced public examination of presidential conduct and limits on executive action. An example that proves this is the 2019 impeachment and subsequent acquittal of President Trump over allegations of abuse of power and obstruction of Congress, underscoring congressional oversight. However, the president may have been held accountable by Congress to a lesser extent, as political alignment between the executive and legislative majority can limit effective oversight and consequences. An example that proves this is when Republican and Democratic leaders voted overwhelmingly to dismiss an impeachment resolution against President Trump in 2025 over military actions, showing partisan dynamics can blunt congressional accountability. The president has a significant role over foreign policy as they direct diplomatic relations, military strategy, and alliances with other nations. An example that proves this is President Biden's leadership in rallying NATO allies and expanding security partnerships to support Ukraine against Russian aggression. However, the president may not have a significant role over foreign policy, as congressional and international constraints can limit unilateral decision-making in global affairs. An example that proves this is how debates in Congress and public opinion have shaped and sometimes restricted executive decisions on foreign military engagements in recent years. Thank you for watching this video on the US presidency. I'll see you in the next one.